Craftsman Online Podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, Editor-in-Chief of Craftsman Online, and welcome to a new year and new season for the Craftsman Online Podcast. As we start this new year, many lodges and jurisdictions are dealing with the same challenges that have been present with the COVID-19 virus and public health emergency. I wanted to have a conversation and discussion on the feelings associated with COVID and how it has affected Freemasons. And for that, I've invited our guest this week, Brother Andrew Doc Berry.
Thanks, man. Good to be here.
We call him Doc because he's a member of Mount Vernon Lodge number 3, which is also my home lodge in Albany, New York. And he's board certified in clinical psychology and counseling psychology and is currently in private practice in Niskayuna, New York. Hence, Brother Doc. Most likely, we're going to be dealing with coronavirus for 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Did you imagine any impact as we look back on February 3rd of 2020? The news was breaking that COVID was approaching a global pandemic status. Did you think that a virus would have this effect on the mental health community?
They are going to be writing about this for decades, to be honest with you. And they means Freemasons, they means the mental health community, they means the folks on Wall Street, they means the folks down in Washington. This is going to be maybe even a multi-generational effect. Kind of like when polio ravaged the United States. There was a lot of writing and a lot of processing that took place because of the lives lost to that. And similarly, we're going to be seeing kind of the same thing happening here.
Did you find yourself looking back to what lessons we could learn historically from the Spanish flu in 1917 for any kind of reference point?
In addition to the current mantras of social distancing, which is, some say, medically very wise, but kind of gets in the way of fraternal relationships of lodge, the best way I can think of to describe it is we can learn a lot from the past, but only really up to a certain point. You can go back and see how all of that carnage affected relationships. And by training as a psychoanalyst, that's one of the things I focus heavily on is relationships. And relationships have been fundamentally and profoundly changed. The virus categorically has had quite an impact on Freemasonry, which is to say, a Zoom meeting is effective in passing information, but to my way of thinking, it bastardizes and cheapens the dynamics of brotherhood, which means being in the same room with each other. And isolating is, again, medically a very good idea. But what we are seeing now is brand new support for a very old idea that's been around since time began, and that is man is a social animal. People need people, and when they're locked away in their homes, it has an effect after a while. I could see it in my practice, and I could certainly hear about it from the brethren in Freemasonry.
As I mentioned in the open, you and I are both members of the same home lodge, Mount Vernon number 3 in Albany. And I can actually remember the last meeting that I attended before the shutdown. We were doing a 3rd degree. It would have been our first meeting for March of 2020. And shortly after that, in our area in upstate New York, everything was being closed, and we affectionately referred to it as the shutdown of New York State. And we wouldn't return to in-person lodge meetings until fall of 2020, which seemed like a year after everything had gone by. Doc, what were your thoughts when you realized that you would not be able to physically attend a lodge meeting for an unknown amount of time?
There's the building itself. When you go down to 67 Corning Place and go in that lodge, the history that's there of over 200 years or however long it's been, and the ambiance of the place. It's what we psychoanalysts refer to as institutional transference. The institution of Freemasonry takes place at a lodge, and not being able to see the altar in person, not being able to watch the letter G light go on in the east, not being able to smell the place. Believe it or not, odor is an incredibly powerful memory trigger. And when I step into that building, I mean, we can make all the jokes we want about it smelling dusty, musty, and old, but in a way, we're smelling history. And to be away from that, it's been quite a bad effect.
Here we are. By the time this episode will air, it's going to be firmly into 2022. A lot of us are looking back and saying, hey, we've dealt with this virus now. We're going on year 3 for COVID. Hopefully there'll be an end in sight, and nobody wants to return to the shutdown and the procedures that had to happen to keep us all safe. But looking back, one of the terms that I heard a lot from brothers and just friends was they felt like something was taken away from them during 2020. Mm-hmm. And I kind of hear that when you talk about Lodge. It was, we were able to have that final meeting in March, and then everything was shut down. We all understood why. And as the slow reopen happened, it was, yeah, we're opening the Lodge meeting, but only X number of members can be in the room. You have to wear gloves. There has to be hand sanitizer at the altar. No dinners beforehand. No contact before or after the meeting. Everything has to be done outside on the city street. And we were getting conditioned to have, as you had mentioned, like man is into the relationships, that physical connection. That was being removed, and that's a big part of what Freemasonry is.
And don't forget also, we pay special attention to people's facial expressions, and that too gets bastardized when everybody's wearing a mask. Understandable for those who have health concerns. But again, it distances the emotional intimacy, the fraternal intimacy, and it dilutes the whole activity. Kind of like, I mean, as I've said before, I'm grateful for the technology of Zoom. And when I'm in my office working with patients, we use a HIPAA-compliant platform known as DoxyMe. But it's not the same as face-to-face. You can get so much more when you're in the room with people without a mask on, just speaking with each other, relating to each other in person. And it's distanced the process. I can't even find the right word here, but I don't like it, and many others don't either. I heard, again, from the underground, I will not mention names, but folks who went to lodge meetings together. They look forward to their lodge meetings with their brethren. They used to sit next to these guys for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Now they can't do that. That, I think, factors into the idea you put forth about something being taken from them. Something very deep, personal, and intimate. And getting back to the whole idea of institutional transference, when I'm in Albany, I often find myself looking in lodge at the very location I was raised during my third, with a smile on my face, because it was such a moving experience. And you can't do the same thing on a Zoom call.
There were those restrictions, and I want to touch on that because I felt for brothers, especially those that when COVID hit, it had almost a 2-year effect with how our Masonic year falls. Mm-hmm. For those not in the New York State jurisdiction, our Masonic year is typically from September until about May or June. Our lodges don't meet for the summer. In other jurisdictions, they can meet year round, but for some, it's like, oh, we don't meet in the summertime. So just imagine in March, about midway through a Masonic year, there was this shutdown. So you had worshipful masters, and these are brothers who had invested more than 5 years, let's say, on their pursuit to get to that chair in the East. And all of a sudden they were presented with this once in a century challenge of trying to overcome. And then on the flip side of that, you had brothers who were being elected into officer positions or pillar positions, as we would say, who didn't really get a full year to learn their role through the regular meetings and the ritual part. I want to talk to you as someone who comes with a background in psychology and understanding of how does that impact a man's psyche when they've prepared for something and they're presented with this challenge, or they don't have the time to learn because of the challenge that's there and they're in these new roles?
The first thing that leaps to mind is a violation of expectations. A lot of these guys who take chairs come from a long line of Masons, and they build up in their mind an expectation of a rite of passage that's done a certain way. There are certain steps to follow, and they build up in their mind that if they put in the time, they put in the work, they memorize that maddening little book we all have, that they will get the same opportunity. Fate tears it away from them. And that is one of the most violent things you can do to another person, is to violate their expectations. So it calls into focus the topic of resiliency and the ability to, as the Marines often say, adapt, improvise, and overcome. This is the hand we are dealt. We can sit here and agonize and scream, "This ain't fair," until we're blue in the face and green in the gills all day, but it's not going to change it. So we have to come up with a reasonable facsimile thereof and be okay with the fact that this is the way it's going to be for the foreseeable future due to circumstances beyond our control. And we can be disappointed, but let's not venture into beating ourselves up over it, because we had nothing to do with it, or our frustration and aggression being taken out on our brethren. We have to survive this together. And this could be, to swipe a phrase from Winston Churchill, if we let it, this could be our finest hour. If Freemasonry survives, if we adapt, we improvise, overcome. And one day, when this bug is finally exterminated, Freemasonry will return to the glory, it will be restored to the glory it once had. Until then, the only thing we can do really is the best we can, which, if you think about it, we could deem a Masonic mission.
I think one of the challenges that Freemasonry was presented with a public health emergency, and it would definitely be a disadvantage, this is not a strength for us as all, is that we are a fraternity that is steeped in ritual, to the point where at certain parts you can ask a question and it agree to somebody, and if you're not following what the ritual outlines, they don't know how to answer that. It's what we would call confusion would now exist in the craft. Routine is a big thing for us. And with those two issues, and that put us at a severe disadvantage at quickly being able to meet these difficulties, wouldn't you say?
Yep. And again, the message that has to come, in my opinion, from the top down, from the Grand Master on down through all jurisdictions, through all regions, into all lodges is, brothers, we're just do the very best you can. Nobody is expecting perfection from anybody, because the rules of the game, so to speak, have been so severely changed.
And I do want to get to that. It's part of the process. There was the shutdown. We were all at home. For lack of a better term, some lodges were better adept at not scrambling to find some sort of way of connecting and programming. For men who have never logged on to their computer for a Google Meet or a Zoom, now we're doing these virtual, which for the most part, if there was a silver lining, and we'll touch on a couple of these. I think this would have been a good thing to happen during the public health emergency, is that we had this downtime in 2020. For me personally, I was able to, quote unquote, travel to lodges that I would never have been able to visit. Attended a meeting of Denver Lodge number 5 in Denver, Colorado. I thought that was fantastic. Virtually, of course. Got to attend other virtual segments, caught up on a lot of reading that I wanted to do, was connecting with brothers that normally I wouldn't have time to meet with, but because, work was at home and I was at home and I had just more time on the clock to do things with. Did you find a way to be positive and productive during the downtime during 2020 for yourself?
I'm pretty hyper-focused in what I do for a living, which is to say, I'm a psychologist, psychoanalyst. I stay hyper-focused on cranking out 45 to 48 sessions every week. I have 2 young children I have to tend to. The best way I can think of to describe how I tried to go, didn't always succeed, but tried to go above and beyond that, was just phone calls to reaching out to guys I knew who were, shall we say, maybe emotionally a little on the fragile side. That's the spirit of Freemasonry. And notice, I say the spirit of Freemasonry to be our brother's keeper, which if you think about it, the spirit of Freemasonry, just because we're not following a script, doesn't mean we can't act like Freemasons. So we reach out. And remember I said a few minutes ago from Winston Churchill, this could be our finest hour. Conceptually, let's reword that. The other word for crisis oftentimes is opportunity. We've been dealt this crappy hand. So the next question, using creative intelligence as well as the moral framework that we've been raised with, how can we take this terrible occurrence and turn it into something good?
Right. And I think the outpouring or the refocus on Masonic education was key for me personally with, the newer brothers in our lodge. I think they got more, well, I would say FaceTime, but in a literal sense on the screen, at least, of working through their catechism and their degree proficiency. I found myself to be in the same spot in a frustrating position as men who were interested in waiting to take their first degree and be obligated as a Mason. I pursued the Scottish Rite and was able to do a lot of the video degrees, but then there's that wall you run into where, this particular one has to be done in person, and we don't know when that's going to be. So I can remember having booked a trip down to Rockville, Long Island to see a Valley degree there in November and having to quickly cancel it because of the different rolling restrictions that were happening throughout New York State. New York State was very difficult with all the different areas and COVID case tracking and literally changing at night. You could be in Buffalo at one point and Albany at the other time, and Buffalo was closed, but Albany was okay, and then almost vice versa. And these cities are 6-8 hours away from each other on the map. I want to get back to the feeling that a lot of us carried in 2020, because I think it's also extended into 2021, is that folks had considered 2021 to be kind of a throwaway or a write-off or a year with an asterisk when it came to Freemasonry. And I felt that a lot of that energy carried into 2021 because men were feeling that they weren't getting the full experience that they had in 2019.
Oh, yeah, everything's been affected. They're going to be making movies and writing novels about this, etc. But yeah, getting back to trying to take something, make it positive, you said you did a lot with Scottish Rite. I finally filled my first passport. It took me 3 years and 3 days to do it, but I stayed as busy as I could. And I do a lot of stuff with a lot of work with veterans and first responders. And COVID, believe me, has affected those folks as well. And I should have mentioned earlier, too, if we think about it, to bring up another sordid reality that we are fighting with, and that is lodges are closing. Freemasonry is not the juggernaut that it once was. And it's a 1-2 punch with lodges closing, and the appendant bodies not having as many members as they once did, et cetera, but only if we let it. About 80%, at the end of the day, 80% of success is just showing up. And that means, again, as I was saying before, doing the best we can until this thing is exterminated from our lives and from our world. Just keep showing up and do the best we can.
And I agree. I think what is going to be the challenge for lodges, especially with the pandemic, was that you weren't able to go to something that guys were beginning to wane on wanting to attend anyways. Mm-hmm. You could get the classic story of, I don't want to hear them read the minutes or the secretary's bills or arguing over roofs and sidewalks and building maintenance, small stuff. Like, why were men wanting to go to the lodge, to have dinner, to see the brothers, right, learn something new, and head home for the evening? And now lodges are faced with that same challenge. It's now twice as hard because the expectation level is so high because there was this thing that was important to me, and now it's really important to me.
And if it's really important, you, along with the rest of us, will find ways to keep it going. And it's going to require a great deal of tenacity and creative intelligence. Freemasonry has, in my estimation, it's been probably through a lot worse. It has been through other pandemics. It has been through world wars. It has been through, et cetera. Just keep showing up. This, from all philosophical schools, this too shall pass. And we have the opportunity to make history, which is a way of saying Freemasonry survived, even though lodges were dwindling to a certain extent, despite the 1-2 punch of COVID. They'll look back on us and say, we still kept it going some way, somehow. And it underscores also how much we need each other. As a friend of mine often says, we are all we have. And COVID has massively proven that to us. But it brings up another topic that we have to be very, very careful of. Each brother is going to have a different viewpoint about masks, about distancing, and so on and so forth. And as we have seen on social media, those disagreements have turned into out-and-out fracases that have severed relationships and broken families apart, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot let that happen in Freemasonry at all.
I want to talk about how COVID also changed. We talked about, its effect on Freemasons, but also on the craft itself, which is a very rare thing where we will actually alter or change our ritual, which happened. I want to address the COVID degrees as they were known. I was able to confer a quote-unquote COVID degree, a first degree. And what had concerned me was that brothers who were interested in pursuing Freemasonry, interested gentlemen who were looking to become a brother in Freemasonry, had heard about this and didn't want to go through this because they wanted, quote-unquote, the real experience. And it was an interesting conversation to have with a man where I said, no. You are getting the same degree. It's changed a little bit because we're not allowed to physically touch each other. There's some separation that has to be here. You're going to have to wear a mask. But I didn't want men to walk away from that night thinking that they weren't getting the same experience that you and I had going through that first or second degree.
The only thing we can do is prepare people and just be 100% honest with them. And we can lament with them the sense of potential loss, which is to say, I didn't get my first, I didn't receive the first degree the way my father did. And that sucks, and that's terrible. But is that what we're going to focus on? Or are we going to focus on getting new brothers in, come what may, so that Freemasonry can survive? I wonder, variations on exactly the same theme, I wonder about the effect of the Great Depression on Freemasonry, when men had to work more than one job and maybe didn't have time to get to a lodge meeting because they had a family to feed. And the Depression went on from 29 all the way through the 30s and then we were thrown right into the Second World War. And yet it some way, somehow survived. I would imagine those brothers from yesteryear had to make some accommodations and some changes in ritual, just as we have to now. And there is a sense of loss. But is that what we're going to focus on? No, I think we should focus on, despite the adaptations we have to undergo, that Freemasonry yet survives.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. I want to thank again my guest this week, Brother Andrew Doc Berry. Thank you for coming on.
Glad to be here. Hope it helps.
If Masonic education is important to you, you can sign up for our email newsletter at craftsmanonline.com. A reminder that new episodes of our podcast are available for download every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.